The year 2023 was supposed to be a chapter of new beginnings, a period of transition defined by the excitement of house hunting and the promise of a future together. For most couples, the expiration of a lease is a logistical hurdle, but for me and my fiancée Ryan, it became the catalyst for a series of events that would fundamentally alter my sense of safety. I have never been someone who thrived in solitude. The quiet of an empty house has always felt heavy, pregnant with a tension I couldn't quite name. But after the summer of 2023, that mild unease transformed into a permanent psychological scar. I haven't stayed overnight anywhere alone since that night, and if you heard what I heard, you wouldn't either. Our journey into the heart of this mystery began with a stroke of apparent good luck. In a housing market defined by skyrocketing prices and cutthroat competition, we found ourselves in a desperate search as our apartment lease ticked toward its end. We didn't want to commit to another full year in a cramped unit, and yet the prospect of buying felt out of reach. That was when a family connection stepped in. One of my father's oldest friends owned a property in a beautiful, upscale area of town. It was a well-maintained home, situated in a neighborhood where the lawns were manicured and the streets were silent. The house had recently become vacant under somber circumstances. The previous tenants had passed away. Because of my father's lifelong friendship with the owner, we were offered a deal that seemed too good to pass up, a month-to-month lease at a significantly discounted rate. It was the perfect bridge to our forever home, or so we thought. However, there was a detail that sat like a weight in my stomach. The previous residents, an elderly couple, hadn't just died. They had both passed away inside the house within weeks of each other. While their deaths weren't the result of foul play or violence, they were simply old. The idea of living in a space so recently vacated by the deceased felt wrong. I am a firm believer in bad energy, the idea that a space can hold on to the echoes of the life and death it has witnessed. Ryan, ever the pragmatist, was unmoved. To him, it was a bargain. To me, it was a graveyard with a kitchen. Ryan's skepticism often manifested as a playful, if slightly irritating, mockery. Throughout the moving process, he would mimic stereotypical ghost sounds, low moans, and rattling chains just to see me jump. He's a good man, truly, but he possesses that particular brand of bravery that comes from never having experienced the unexplainable. He viewed my fear as a quirk to be teased out of me. The house itself was a relic of a different era, dominated by a thick, suffocating tan carpet that covered every square inch of the living space. It was ugly, but it was also stained. In the center of the living room sat a large, dark discoloration that immediately drew the eye. When Ryan asked the owner about the origin of the stain, the answer we received was more haunting than any ghost story. The elderly woman who lived there had suffered a catastrophic fall. She hit her head on an end table, and that dark patch on the carpet was the site of her final struggle. She was taken to the hospital that night, but she never returned. Her husband, perhaps broken by the tragedy, or simply succumbing to his own frailties, suffered a fatal heart attack in the basement just a few weeks prior. We were living in a house where the walls had quite literally closed in on its previous occupants. To make the space livable, the owner agreed to a series of cosmetic updates. Within 48 hours of our arrival, a crew arrived to tear out the stained carpet and replace it with sleek hardwoods. They repainted the interior, masking the smell of age with the sharp, clean scent of fresh latex. These changes did help settle my nerves, as did the installation of a modern security system. It was one of those vocal systems that announced every movement. Whenever a door was opened, a robotic, feminine voice would chime through the house. Front door open. It was repetitive and quickly became an annoyance, but in the back of my mind, it provided a digital layer of protection. By early July, we had been in the house for about a month. The initial dread had begun to scab over, replaced by the routine of daily life. However, a major test of my nerves was approaching. Ryan was scheduled to leave for the weekend to attend a bachelor party. It would be my first time staying in the house alone. On Friday, July 7th, I left for work at 7 a.m., giving Ryan a final goodbye. He was heading out a few hours later and wouldn't be back until Sunday. I arrived home that evening to an empty house. The silence felt different, this time sharper. I tried to drown it out with the comforts of routine. I ordered Thai food, a treat Ryan usually avoids, and settled onto the couch to watch Time's The Office. It was my comfort show, a deliberate attempt to keep the atmosphere light. But as the clock neared midnight, the atmosphere shifted. From the depths of the house, specifically the basement where the old man had taken his last breath, I began to hear a sound. It wasn't a bang or a crash, but a rhythmic, unsettling creaking. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses settle, wood expands and contracts. I turned off the television, hoping the silence would reveal the sound to be something mundane. That was when Rex, our Australian cattle dog, reacted. Rex was not a barker. He was a stoic, protective animal who usually communicated through low howls or physical presence. But tonight, he ran to the basement door, his fur standing on end, and let out a barrage of sharp, aggressive barks. He sounded tense, his body vibrating with a perceived threat. I approached the door with a trembling hand, trying to console him, but he wouldn't budge. In a moment of misplaced courage, I gripped the handle, turned it, and flicked on the basement light. Rex immediately stopped barking and transitioned into a low, guttural growl that resonated in his chest. I looked down the stairs, but the darkness at the bottom seemed to swallow the light. I remembered the heart attack. I remembered the man who died down there, alone in the dark. I felt frozen. I couldn't bring myself to descend. I held my phone out and snapped a photo into the void, but the flash only revealed a wall of impenetrable shadows. I retreated to the bedroom, locking the door behind me. Rex followed, but he didn't sleep. He spent the entire night at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door, ears twitching at every microscopic sound. His hypervigilance was more terrifying than his barking had been. I didn't sleep. I waited for the door to open. Morning brought a temporary reprieve. The sun filtered through the windows, and the terrors of the night felt like a fever dream. I decided to keep busy with chores. I gathered a load of laundry and headed toward the laundry room, but when I stepped inside, my heart stopped. The washing machine, a heavy, industrial-sized unit, had been moved. It wasn't just a few inches out of place from a heavy spin cycle. It had been pulled several feet away from the wall, sitting almost in the center of the small room. I stood there, breathless. Moving that machine required significant physical force. It wasn't something that happened by accident. I checked the floor, the hoses, everything. There was no explanation. I called Ryan, my voice shaking as I described the basement and the laundry room. I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He suggested the machine might have just walked during a cycle, but he could tell I was unraveling. He promised to leave the party early and be home by Sunday morning. Saturday night, however, proved that the house wasn't finished with me. At 9:18 p.m., a sound like a physical explosion rocked the house. It was a massive concussive boom that seemed to originate from right outside the walls. Seconds later, my phone chimed, a notification from the garage camera. I opened the app, my hands shaking. The video showed our garage door, a door we never used, as our vehicles were too large to fit slowly sliding open on its own. In the driveway, strange flashes of light, like silent fireworks or electrical arcs, danced across the concrete. I ran to the door leading to the garage and peered out. The driveway was empty. No smoke, no debris, no evidence of an explosion. Just the cold, night air, and the garage door standing wide open like a mouth. I retreated to my bed, checking the security alarm 3 separate times. Rex was back at his post, growling at the door. I eventually drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, only to be jolted awake at 3:39 a.m. Someone or something was pounding on my front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was a frantic, continuous hammering, as if someone was trying to break through the wood with their bare fists. I was paralyzed. And then, the security system's automated voice cut through the darkness with chilling precision. Front door open. The silence that followed the automated voice was heavier than the darkness itself. Front door open. Those 3 words, spoken in a calm, synthesized tone, felt like a death sentence. I sat frozen in the center of my bed, my breathing shallow, my ears straining to catch the sound of footsteps on the hardwood floors we had so recently installed. My phone, my only lifeline, remained a useless slab of black glass in my hand. I remember the frantic rhythm of my heart, a staccato beat that seemed loud enough to alert whoever or whatever was now inside the house. The silence was broken not by footsteps, but by a sound far more intimate and terrifying. The slow, deliberate rattling of my bedroom doorknob. It wasn't the sound of someone trying to force their way in. It was the sound of someone testing the lock, a rhythmic jiggling that sent waves of nausea through me. I found my voice then, a ragged scream that tore through the house. "Go away! Get out!" By the time the police arrived, the house was a tomb. They found the front door standing wide, the deadbolt fully retracted despite my certainty that I had locked it. Their search was professional, but ultimately fruitless. No one was in the basement where the old man had died. No one was in the living room where the bloodstain had once been. When I showed them the footage of the garage door opening and the strange flashes on the driveway, they offered the only explanation their training allowed: local kids with fireworks. When I asked about the front door, the officer shrugged, citing the humid July air and the settling of an old house. But houses don't settle by unlatching deadbolts. They don't settle by pounding on doors at 3:39 in the morning. I left that house as the sun began to bleed over the horizon, Rex shivering in the passenger seat beside me. We stayed at my parents' for days, and though Ryan eventually joined me and we lived there for 2 more months, the home feeling was gone. It was just a structure of wood and glass, where things that shouldn't happen did. 3 years have passed since that night, and while Ryan remains a skeptic, I live with the quiet, persistent knowledge that some doors open for reasons we aren't meant to understand. For years, I believed my greatest struggle was simply the noise of the neighborhood. I lived in a small, modest house that shared a property line with a local bar. It wasn't a direct neighbor. There was a thick, skeletal line of trees that acted as a buffer, but the proximity was enough to make my weekends a living hell. I worked retail, a job that demanded I be on my feet and alert while the rest of the world was nursing hangovers. From my driveway, if you angled your head just right, you could see the side of the bar where the smokers congregated. It was a revolving door of humanity, the loud, the drunk, and the occasionally belligerent. I was a homebody by nature, a man who found more comfort in the pages of a vintage comic book or the intricate details of a collectible figurine than in the chaotic social theater of a pub. I was socially awkward, the kind of person who viewed a simple hello from a stranger as a high-stakes tactical maneuver. My best friend, Ela, was the polar opposite. She was a force of nature, convinced that my soulmate was out there, probably hiding behind a stack of graphic novels. She spent her Saturday nights acting as my self-appointed wingman, though her efforts usually resulted in me retreating further into my shell. On one particular Saturday, Ela had come over for dinner, filling my quiet living room with her infectious energy before heading out to meet her girlfriend. I walked her to her car around 10 p.m. The air was thick with the sounds of the bar-muffled bass lines and the high-pitched shriek of laughter. As Isla drove away, I lingered for a moment, my eyes drifting toward the smoking area. A group of 7 or 8 women were gathered there, their voices carrying clearly across the damp night air. They were in high spirits, fueled by cheap gin and the freedom of the weekend. But one woman stood apart. She was small, with blonde hair that looked almost white under the harsh fluorescent lights of the bar's exterior. She wasn't talking to the others. She was staring directly at me. I looked behind me, thinking perhaps a neighbor had stepped out, but I was alone. When I looked back, she didn't look away. Instead, she began to wave. It wasn't a friendly, casual wave. It was aggressive, her entire arm moving in a wide, frantic arc. I gave a hesitant, awkward wave back, hoping to end the interaction. In response, she blew a kiss. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made the hair on my arm stand up. I retreated inside, locking the door and turning to my video games to drown out the lingering unease. It was just a drunk woman, I told myself. A harmless, intoxicated moment. At 1:30 a.m., the first knock came. It was soft, tentative. I paused my game, the silence of the house suddenly feeling very thin. I waited, and a few seconds later, it came again, 3 light taps against the wood. Living next to a bar, you get used to the occasional lost soul looking for a bathroom or a taxi, so I wasn't immediately terrified. I peered out the small window beside the door, but the porch was empty. The motion-activated light hadn't even triggered. I sat back down, but the rhythm of the night had changed. 15 minutes later, driven by a nagging instinct, I looked out the window again. My car was parked in the driveway, and my heart skipped a beat. The interior dome light was on. As I focused, I could see that the driver's side door wasn't just unlocked, it was slightly ajar. Anger flared up, momentarily masking my fear. I assumed a drunk patron was looking for spare change. I stepped out into the cool night, my eyes scanning the shadows of the trees as I marched to the car. I checked the back seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it with a sharp click of the key fob. When I stepped back inside my house and threw the deadbolt, the smell hit me. It was thick, cloying, and sweet. Lavender. It was the unmistakable scent of a heavy perfume, as if someone had been standing directly in my entryway only moments before. Isla didn't wear perfume. I certainly didn't. The scent was so fresh, it felt like a physical presence in the room. I tried to shake it off, retreating to my bedroom and turning on a movie to distract myself. But as the house settled, I heard it, the sound of feet. They weren't heavy footsteps. They were light, rapid, and barefoot, moving with a terrifying speed through the hallway outside my door. And then, the giggling started. It was a soft, feminine sound, bubbling with a manic kind of glee. It was the sound of someone playing a game I didn't know the rules to. I stayed in my room, my back against the door, and dialed 911. "Someone is in my house," I whispered into the phone. While the operator stayed on the line, the sounds outside my door vanished. The giggling stopped. The running stopped. Silence returned, but it was a predatory silence. Armed with nothing but an old golf club, I eventually eased my door open, the adrenaline finally overriding the paralysis. I moved through the dark hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped. The moonlight was streaming through the window, illuminating a figure standing perfectly still by the sink. It was her, the woman from the bar. She was wearing a tattered pink dress that looked like it belonged in a different decade, her blonde hair matted and wild. She didn't turn around at first. She just stared out the window into the darkness. "Hey, buddy," she said, her voice cracking with a chilling familiarity. "I know you're there." Then she snapped. She turned with a speed that wasn't human, her eyes wide and vacant, and she began to sprint toward me. I didn't think. I lunged for the bathroom, slamming the door and locking it just as her body hit the wood on the other side. She began to howl, begging me to let her in, her fingernails scratching against the paint. When the police finally kicked in my front door, she was gone. The back door was swinging wide in the wind, but as I stepped out of the bathroom, shaking and pale, the lead officer pointed to the floor. There, resting exactly where I had been standing moments before the chase began, was a steak knife from my own kitchen block. She hadn't just been playing a game, she had been waiting for me to come out. The bar owner later confirmed she had been a problem guest that night, a woman who seemed to have appeared from nowhere, bothering patrons until she was forcibly removed. She had disappeared into the trees when he threatened to call the police. I never saw her again, but I never forgot the smell of lavender, or the way she looked in that tattered pink dress, waiting in the moonlight for Buddy to come home. For Julie, solitude wasn't a burden. It was a luxury she had earned through years of relentless professional grinding. As a high-end interior decorator in her mid-30s, she had spent a decade transforming the living spaces of the elite, helping others realize their visions of comfort and security. Her success allowed her to finally purchase her own sanctuary, a dream home that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her career. But for the past year, that dream has been a hollow shell. Julie no longer lives alone. She can't. The silence of an empty house, once her greatest source of peace, is now a trigger for a level of primal fear that most people will never have to understand. The intrusion didn't begin with a broken window or a scream in the night. It began with a shuffle. It was a subtle, dry sound, like a cardboard box being nudged across a wooden floor. At first, it only happened while she was immersed in her work in the home office. She would be deep into a floor plan or a color palette when the sound would break her concentration. It was brief, maybe a second or two, just enough to make her tilt her head and listen to the silence that followed. She did what any logical person would do. She gaslit herself. She blamed the settling of the foundation or the expansion of the floorboards. When the shuffling became a semi-regular occurrence, occurring almost every afternoon, she pivoted her theory to squirrels. She remembered her childhood home, where rodents had nested in the eaves, creating a frantic, scratching soundtrack that kept the family awake. She convinced herself that this was merely a maintenance issue, a task to be added to her ever-growing to-do list. She even wrote herself sticky notes. Call pest control about the attic, but the squirrels were getting bolder. One night the workload was particularly heavy, and Julie didn't crawl into bed until nearly 2 a.m. The house was deathly still, the kind of silence that feels heavy in your ears. As she lay there, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, the shuffling returned. But this time, it wasn't a brief nudge. It was a continuous rhythmic movement directly above her head. Driven by a mix of irritation and growing unease, Julie stood up on her mattress, pressing her ear against the cold plaster of the ceiling. She expected to hear the frantic pitter-patter of tiny claws. Instead, she heard something that turned her blood to ice. It was the slow, heavy, unmistakable sound of human breathing. Directly above her bedroom was a crawl space, a cramped, unfinished attic that she had never used. It was accessible only by a pull-down ladder in the hallway, a ladder she hadn't touched since the day she moved in. The realization that something or someone was exhaling just inches above her sleep-deprived head sent a jolt of adrenaline through her system. Despite her terror, the logical part of her brain fought for control. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself. "It's the HVAC system." To prove herself right, she dragged a chair into the hallway. She had to see. She reached for the pull-down string, which was tucked neatly against the wall, and yanked it. The ladder creaked open, releasing a puff of stale attic air. Julie climbed just high enough to poke her head into the darkness. Her flashlight swept across the insulation and the heavy wooden support beams. It was empty. Or, at least, it appeared to be. The shadows cast by the beams were long and distorted, and she didn't linger long enough to investigate the corners. She slammed the hatch shut, retreated to the living room, and turned on every light in the house. She stayed on the couch, the television blaring a mindless sitcom to drown out the silence. As the sun began to hint at the horizon, Julie drifted into a shallow sleep. She was jarred awake by a sound that didn't come from the television. It was the distinct, low-frequency groan of a door hinge. A creak. It was the sound of her bedroom door, the door she always left wide open to let the air circulate being moved. She froze on the couch, her heart hammering against her ribs. She crept toward the hallway, her eyes adjusting to the dim morning light. At the end of the hall, her office door was shut, but as she looked up, her breath hitched. The pull-down string for the crawl space wasn't tucked away anymore. It was dangling in the center of the hallway, swaying almost imperceptibly, as if someone had just let go of it. Panic took over. Julie moved toward her bedroom, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, confirming it was the source of the noise that had woken her. The room looked untouched, but as she walked toward her nightstand to grab her phone, she spotted something foreign on the rug. It was a small, dark clump of dried mud. Julie knelt down to inspect it. As she lowered herself toward the floor, the world seemed to go silent, except for one sound. That breathing. It wasn't coming from the ceiling anymore. It was coming from beneath her. She didn't think. She simply leaned over and lifted the edge of the bedskirt. There, lying flat on his stomach in the darkness, was a middle-aged man. He was staring directly at her, his eyes wide and unblinking. Julie screamed a raw, guttural sound that tore through the house. She scrambled backward, her palms slipping on the hardwood as she tried to find her footing. The man didn't jump out at her. He didn't reach for her. He simply stayed there, his voice calm and terrifyingly familiar as he whispered, "Hi, Julie. It's okay. It's okay." The use of her name was the final blow. She didn't stay to hear another word. She bolted from the room, flew down the stairs, and didn't stop running until she was in her car peeling out of the driveway. She fled to a 24-hour diner a few miles away, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold her phone to call the police. When the authorities arrived at the dream home, the man was gone, but the evidence of his residency was chillingly thorough. In the cramped crawl space above her bed, the police found a nest. There was a small travel pillow, several empty water bottles, and a collection of food wrappers. He hadn't just been there that night. He had been living there for weeks, watching her, listening to her, and learning her routine. The investigation eventually led to a terrifying theory. Julie's father had once been friends with a man who had developed an unhealthy, obsessive fixation on Julie years prior. Her father had cut him off, but the man had clearly never moved on. Though the police couldn't find him that morning, the description matched an older, more weathered version of that same family friend. Julie never spent another night alone in that house. She sold it months later, unable to look at the ceiling or the space beneath her furniture without seeing those unblinking eyes. Today, she has a roommate and a state-of-the-art security system, but the psychological scars remain. She learned the hardest way possible that a locked door is only a barrier if the threat is on the outside. But when the threat is already in the crawl space, waiting for you to turn out the lights, there is no such thing as safety.